a really good guy. He mowed his neighbor's lawn, he offered to fix his friends' cars, he would host these great dinner parties at his house. But underneath that charming outer layer, Armin Meiwes was a deeply disturbed individual. In 2001, Armin would place an ad on the internet seeking a young, well-built man that is looking to be slaughtered and then consumed. Meiwes actually got a lot of replies to this, and people acted like they were interested, but I think people were just responding because it was such an outrageous thing he was asking for, so no one went through with it. Until a man named Bernard Brandes saw it, who had previously placed an ad on the internet himself, asking if there was anybody out there that would slaughter and eat him. So perfect match. So Brandes reaches out to Armin and says, yes, I'd love to. And on March 9th, 2001, the two meet up at Armin's house. Brandes lays down in the bathtub while Armin sets up a video camera. He wants to film this for a variety of reasons, but mostly he wants to make sure that everybody sees that Brandes is doing this willingly. On camera, Brandes gives Armin the go-ahead. Initially, Armin tries biting into Brandes, but apparently he was too chewy, so Brandes suggests he gets a knife. After successfully removing a piece of Brandes, Armin fries it up in a pan, and the two of them begin to eat it. But apparently it was too burned to either of their liking, and they would feed that piece of him to the dog. At this point, Brandes is in and out of consciousness because he's losing a lot of blood, so Armin decides to take a break and go to his room and read a Star Trek book. When Armin goes back in the bathroom, it's clear that Brandes is still alive, but he's on the verge of death. So after much deliberation and quite a bit of praying, Armin ultimately ends Brandes' life and then proceeds to butcher him and put all of his meat into a freezer. Over the next 10 months, Armin would consume over 44 pounds of Brandes. In December of 2001, Armin put another ad online seeking somebody else that wanted to be eaten, and that ad would get sent to the police, who would go to Armin's house. They would find Brandes' remains behind pizza boxes in the back of his freezer, and they would arrest Armin. Despite showing police the videotape that showed Brandes repeatedly consenting to what was happening to him, Armin was still given a life sentence. This is the picture that Brandes put online in hopes that it would attract someone that would want to eat him. And this is the bathtub where Armin Meiwes would grant Brandes that wish. She was 21 years old. She married the love of her life, Charles Bud Kunst, and they moved into a house together in San Anselmo, California. Together they had 6 children and 11 grandchildren. They were known as a very active couple, that when they were not with their family and their grandkids, they were out on a hiking trail somewhere enjoying the outdoors. In 1998, Rosemary's life was derailed when she and her husband were in a horrific car accident. When she came to in the hospital, she was very badly injured, and she was told that her husband of nearly 50 years had not survived. Rosemary was devastated. She was lost without Bud. But for the next several months, she poured her energy into her rehab, which took up a lot of her time, and it kept her mind off of this terrible loss. But when she got back to strength and returned home, a wave of grief washed over her, and she began to desperately miss Bud. In 2000, when Rose turned 70, she heard about a backpacking trip that was being led by a group called the Earth Circle Organization, and it sounded like the perfect way for Rose to attempt to reconnect with her late husband. The group was led by an elder and chief of the Carrick tribe. His name was Charlie Red Hawk Tom, and every year he would bring this group out to Spirit Lake, which is inside of a wilderness area near Mount Shasta in California, and there they would go to the altar that Red Hawk had built right on the edge of this lake, and they would perform spirit dances and attempt to communicate with their dead loved ones. Rose wasn't going into this thinking she was literally going to be speaking to Bud. She wanted to just find a way to connect with him spiritually, so she was very excited about this trip. The lake itself sits at the base of a heavily forested bowl with high steep walls all around it. In fact, some people say it reminds them of being inside of a mini volcano. And because of those high steep walls, there's actually only one way in or out to the lake, and that's on the north side. The only other semi-feasible way to get in or out of the lake would be on the south side, where a river flows down into the lake. And where that river flows, the embankment is less steep, although it's still a 70-degree angle and would require climbing gear, and the terrain would be completely slick from the water running over it. So you could do it, but realistically, nobody does that. So on August 17th, Rosemary, along with Red Hawk's 12-year-old son, a cook, and 11 other people, set out for Spirit Lake. After a rigorous 12-mile horseback ride, they finally arrived at Spirit Lake, and they established their camp right on the trail that leads in and out. That night, all the participants had dinner together, and then they made their way over to the altar right next to the lake where Red Hawk was, and he performed a spirit dance, and then afterwards, as a group, they attempted to call out to their dead loved ones. The following morning at 9 a.m., once everyone was up, Red Hawk informed the group that they were going to take a day trip to another lake, and they'd be back that evening. Rose told Red Hawk that she'd actually prefer to just stay at their campsite and enjoy the beauty of the lake, and Red Hawk told her that was just fine. So Red Hawk and the main group left, leaving behind Rosemary, as well as Red Hawk's 12-year-old son named Chalet and the cook. A little while later, at 1 p.m., Rose decided she wanted to take a little hike around the side of the lake, and so she asked Chalet if he wanted to join her. He said, "Thank you for the offer, but I'm going to stay here with the cook." And so Rosemary said, "That's totally fine. I don't mind going by myself." And so she asked the cook for some food. He handed her a bag lunch. She took it, said thank you, and then set off by herself heading south. 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., when Red Hawk and the rest of the group got back to the camp, Chalet and the cook informed him that Rosemary had not come back yet. A group was immediately sent out to look for her, but there was no sign of her. And so Red Hawk turned to his son and to the cook and said, "Explain to me again what happened." And they said she was totally normal. She just wanted to go for a hike, and she took some food, and we watched her disappear into the trees. They also told Red Hawk that they had been sitting in the trail that leads in and out of the lake the entire time Rosemary was gone, and they never saw her. So she didn't leave the lake. She's somewhere out there. Confused and very concerned, Red Hawk had one of the other participants leave the lake and go contact authorities, and within 24 hours, there were 50 searchers combing the lake for Rosemary. The head of the search and rescue team was a guy named Grizz Adams, who had led many other search and rescue efforts. After studying the area and talking to Chalet and the cook and the others who were there, he just could not understand how a 70-year-old woman had managed to vanish so quickly and completely, because there's no way she climbed out the south exit because she didn't have climbing gear, and physically she probably wasn't capable of that even with the right gear, and she didn't leave through the north exit, the main trail, because Chalet and the cook were there the entire time and they never saw her. So where was she? As the search continued to find nothing, Grizz called in more searchers on horseback, helicopters, and dog teams. But the dog teams immediately proved to be useless because they were unable to pick up her scent, despite the fact they knew exactly where she started and where she was going. Grizz said that was highly unusual. For the next several days, searchers looked in and around the lake and up onto the mountainsides, and all they could ever find was a small tuft of Rosemary's hair about a half-mile away from where she was last seen. But this hair did not help investigators come up with a theory as to what happened. Ultimately, after almost a week of searching and not finding their mother, Rosemary's children elected to terminate the search. Grizz Adams, the head of the search effort, said the only time he's ever seen something like this is when someone was trying to disappear. They were trying to end their life. But Rosemary, before she went on this hike, she asked Chalet to come with her. She wanted company. That's not indicative of someone that's trying to hurt themselves. But regardless of the reason, to this day, Rosemary has never been found. So Nika Cave in Chihuahua, Mexico, punctured through the ground and discovered this flooded cavern. After pumping the water out and stepping inside of this cavern, they were amazed to see these massive gypsum crystals that had formed on the walls and the ceiling all over this cave. Although the crystals were beautiful, they were far less valuable than what these miners were after, which was silver. So instead of trying to, mine out these crystals, they told the locals in the area that they had found this cave and that they really ought to come down here and protect it because it's this amazing natural wonder. And so for the next 100 years, the locals in Chihuahua, Mexico, basically kept this cave that they nicknamed the Cave of Swords under lock and key so that no one would go in there and destroy these amazing crystals. Fast forward to the year 2000, and two men are inside of this mine, not the Nika mine where the Cave of Swords is located, but a mine that was right up against it. And they're drilling down, and they're actually at the same level of where the Cave of Swords is located. And they don't know it yet, but they're drilling underneath the Cave of Swords. And they eventually puncture into the rock, revealing this underground flooded cavern. Now, these two men are not tracking that this is right underneath the Cave of Swords. So they're not thinking there could be crystals inside of this flooded cavern. They're thinking there could be silver down there. So after pumping all the water out of this cavern, they crawl down inside and it opens up into this massive cavern with these enormous crystals coming out of the ceiling, the walls, everywhere. And they are like 10 times, 15 times bigger than any of the biggest crystals inside of the Cave of Swords. These are literally the biggest crystals in the world, and this cavern looks like Superman's Fortress of Solitude. It's this unbelievable landscape. This new cave would be dubbed the Giant Crystal Cave, and like its counterpart, the Cave of Swords, it would be handed over to locals to protect. Now, you'd think people would be lining up like crazy to get inside either of these two caves to see these natural wonders. But the truth is, Nobody wants to go inside of these caves because they're death traps. Even though both of these caves have had the water drained out of them, their humidity level is still 100%, which means if you're in there too long in either of these two caves, you run the risk of your lungs starting to fill with water, effectively drowning you. In fact, scientists speculate that it would take about 10 minutes for this to happen to you if you were inside one of these caves, assuming you were not wearing a special breathing device that was pumping dry air back into you. But even if you were wearing these special air tanks, the cave would still kill you in about an hour because the temperature exceeds 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you combine the extreme heat with the humidity and the tight enclosed nature of an underground cave, you have a natural oven that if you stay in there too long, it will cook you alive. So the only people that go inside of these caves are researchers that wear all the special equipment, and they only go inside for a couple of minutes at most. But in 2001, so 1 year after the discovery of the Big Crystal Cave, one of the workers who helped drain out the Big Crystal Cave decided, you know what, I want a crystal for myself. And so using his understanding of the mine and his access to this particular section of the mine, he made his way down and got inside of the Big Crystal Cave. Now, the only special equipment he had was a saw, because he figured he could get in there and saw off a piece of one of these crystals and get out of there in just a couple of minutes, certainly well before anything bad would happen to him. So he gets inside, he identifies the crystal he wants, and he starts sawing off the bottom of this crystal. But it dislodges a huge chunk of the crystal that falls on him. Now, when it fell on him, that didn't kill him, but it pinned him inside of this cave. At this point, reality must have sunk in very quickly for this guy. He didn't tell anyone where he was going because what he was doing was illegal, and he knows that nobody checks inside of these caves to see if people are trapped or stuck, because they don't expect people to go into these caves, and they're off limits. A couple of days later, researchers went down into Big Crystal Cave, and they discovered this guy still pinned underneath the big crystal he had cut from the ceiling. It was unclear whether he had died from drowning or from being cooked alive, but either way, he was deceased. To this day, Big Crystal Cave and the Cave of Swords are strictly off limits. He started having severe chest pains, and at first he tried to ignore it, but it got so bad he could barely stand up, and then he began coughing up blood, and so finally he went to the emergency room. When he got there, even before the doctors examined him or gave him an x-ray, just based on the way he presented to them, being pale in the face and hunched over and very sick looking, they assumed this must be something very serious. So that day, they brought Mr. Sidorkin in for an examination, and after talking to him and hearing about all of his symptoms and just looking at him, the assumption was he probably has a tumor in his lungs. And so they sent him in for an x-ray, and afterwards the radiologist looked at the x-ray and confirmed that, yep, there is a mass growing inside of your lungs. And so before they went to just start removing huge pieces of his lung, they told him that they would like to do a biopsy where they remove a small piece of the tissue and test it to see if it's cancerous or not. And so Mr. Sidorkin is terrified, but he says okay. He schedules his surgery. He goes in a couple days later, and the surgeon pulls out a piece of his lung tissue, and as it's sitting on the tray, he looks down at the tissue, the surgeon does, and he realizes there is something hidden inside of the tissue, as if the tissue was like an envelope holding something inside of it. And so he opened it up, and there, growing on the side of his lung, was a small fir tree. It was 5 centimeters long, it was green, it looked very lively, it was just a thriving little tree. The doctors believed Mr. Sidorkin, who was a botanist, had inhaled a seed of a fir tree, and it got lodged inside of his lung tissue. And then as it grew, its pine needles began piercing his blood capillaries, causing him to cough up blood. After the discovery of what was inside of his lung, a spokeswoman for the Royal Botanic Gardens in London said that it is possible for a seed to germinate inside of the dark, damp conditions inside of a lung, but it is unbelievably bizarre. When doctors informed Mr. Sidorkin that he did not have cancer, he had a tree, Mr. Sidorkin was shocked, and he said, I never got the sense that there was a tree growing inside of me. But more than shocked, he was just relieved that he was cancer-free. There is a picture of this tree inside of his lung tissue, but it's a bit graphic, so if you want to see it, go ahead and Google tree in lung, and I'm sure you'll find. December 21st, 1980, a woman in her 40s walked into a jail cell in Los Angeles, California. Now, in this jail cell already was another inmate. Her name was Etta Louise Smith. She was 32 years old, and at the time, she was laying on one of the benches inside of this cell. Etta had actually been in jail for 4 days leading up to this moment. The police were sure Etta had something to do with the savage murder of a nurse in the area, but they really didn't understand what role she had played. In fact, virtually everything about Etta was very confusing to police. And Etta herself was not really doing herself any favors because she wasn't really explaining how she had the information that she had. Now, Etta had already gone through a 10-hour-long interrogation, which led police nowhere. She had undergone a polygraph test, which didn't lead to any new answers. And she had also undergone a thorough strip search. She had been kept without food for 24 hours at one point. She had been left in this cold jail cell without shoes for 4 days. But she just wouldn't crack. She would not confess to playing a role in this murder. And so this was why police on this day had decided to go another route to get information out of Etta. That woman in her 40s who had just walked into Etta's jail cell was pretending to be an inmate, but in reality, she was an undercover cop. And her job was to go into this jail cell, befriend Etta, win her trust, and see if maybe then Etta would begin revealing information about what she had done. And so after this undercover cop walked into the jail cell, the jailer shut the door behind them, closing in the undercover cop and Etta. And at this point, Etta was woken up by the noise and she sat up on her bench and she looked over at the undercover cop. And the cop, she was immediately struck by Etta's appearance. Etta did not look like a murderer. She was this little, slight, totally unthreatening person who really just looked like a suburban mom who maybe had a white-collar job. But the undercover cop also knew that appearing to be totally harmless was a great cover for being a murderer, and so this could all totally be an act. And also, to this undercover cop, it just seemed like Etta was way too calm and collected given her circumstances. She is effectively wanted for murder, and the police are putting so much pressure on her to get her to speak about it, and she's just laying down sleeping in her cell, making no big deal about it. But the undercover cop maintained a very neutral persona, and she sat down, and at some point she asked Etta, hey, what are you in here for? And Etta, she kind of just looked down and smiled for a second, and then when she looked back up at the undercover cop, she said, you're never going to believe me. The undercover cop at this said, oh, come on, how bad could it be? Tell me what's going on here. Why are you in here? And it was at this point that Etta would say something that nearly caused the cop to break character. Because Etta, she would say, well, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a movie. Now, the undercover police officer tried to be as neutral as possible as she's hearing this, but in her mind, she's like, okay, well, I clearly just discovered Etta's motive for being involved in this murder. Etta wants to be famous. She wants this made into a movie where she's the star. At the same time this conversation was happening, in an office within the jailhouse, a police captain was listening in on the conversation between Etta and this undercover cop. And when he listened to Etta talk about wanting to turn her story into a movie, he just shook his head in disgust because Etta had just brought police to the location of the body of 31-year-old Melanie Uribe, a local nurse who was robbed and savagely beaten to death and then dumped in a canyon behind a bush. And now here Etta was talking about how she could get publicity around this terrible, horrible crime. It just did not sit right with the captain. And so as the captain was sitting there kind of watching this conversation transpire between the undercover cop and Etta, the captain was beginning to form a theory of what actually happened to Melanie Uribe and how Etta played a role in her murder. His theory went like this. 6 days earlier, the victim, Melanie Uribe, had left for her shift at the hospital in Burbank, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, but she had never arrived for her shift. And so when her colleagues had noticed her absence, eventually the police were called and a search was launched to find her. But after 48 hours, the police had not found Melanie and there were no signs as to what happened to her. She had just vanished. And it was at that point, 2 days after Melanie had gone missing, that Etta just showed up at the police station and said she knew where Melanie was. And so the detective who was talking to Etta at the time when she came in and said this, he brought out a map and he said, okay, point to where she is. And Etta had immediately pointed to this area on the map called Lopez Canyon, which was about 25 miles away from Los Angeles. And she would tell the detective that, yeah, Melanie is somewhere right in there. When the detective asked Etta, how do you know this? Etta would say she just knew. And then when the detective followed up and said, Etta, this is pretty incriminating that you're telling me you know where someone's body is. What's motivating you to come and say this to me? And Etta would say that her conscience was weighing on her terribly, and she just had to go to police. Now, the detective who talked to Etta when she first came into the police station really didn't know what to make of Etta, because she looked so unthreatening, and what she was saying, she was saying with a lot of confidence, and it seemed like she was really eager to help the investigation versus just clearing her conscience, which is kind of what she said she was doing. And when the detective looked into who Etta was, he discovered that she had a great job. She worked at an aerospace company in Burbank, California, and she even had governmental clearance. And so this woman clearly has been vetted by the government and by high-level companies, and she's passed the tests. But at the same time, the detective knew there was no good reason for why Etta would have this information, the location of a dead body. I mean, either she's just wrong and there is no body there, or if the body's there, the most likely scenario is that Etta was involved in killing this person or disposing of their body, or maybe both. So the detective said to Etta, hey, come back tomorrow and we'll take a police helicopter, we'll fly out over that canyon, and we'll see if we can find Melanie's body together. And so Etta said, okay, sounds good. She turned and she left. But then just an hour later, Etta came back into the police station with her 2 young kids in the car, and she would tell that detective that she actually just drove out with her kids to that canyon and had found Melanie's body. In fact, she told the detective that her 7-year-old child, who was in the car right now, had been the one to actually find Melanie's body. The detective could not believe this woman, 1, had gone out by herself to do this, but 2, had brought along her kids as well? Like, what's going on with this person? But regardless of how weird this was, the detective immediately rounded up some backup, and with Etta's help, they went out to a particular spot in this canyon, and sure enough, when they got out there, right in the spot where Etta said it would be, was Melanie's badly beaten body. And so it was at this point that the police captain had grabbed Etta and said, you're under arrest. I'm putting you in a cell because there's no way you could have known about this unless you were somehow involved. The captain thought by putting Etta in jail for a couple of days, she'd get scared and start talking. But 4 days had gone by and Etta had not cracked. She had not given up anything beyond telling the undercover police officer that she thought her story that was kind of still developing would likely be turned into a movie. And so the captain really didn't know what to do, because at this point, Etta had not actually committed a crime. It was not a crime to find a dead person's body and report it to the police. And there was no evidence that actually tied Etta to the murder. All the police had was the fact that Etta came to them and told them that she knew where the body was, and then they actually found the body. But that's all they had. But the police captain would catch a break on that 4th day because he would receive a phone call that would totally change everything about this case. It would turn out on December 17th, 1983, so the same day that Etta would go into the police station to report that she knew where Melanie Uribe's body was, well, on that day, Etta was at work listening to the radio and filing some paperwork. And as Etta listened to the radio, the local newscaster was talking about Melanie Uribe and how she was missing. And the newscaster talked about how police had found her truck and it was parked on this dead-end street, and that police were searching nearby residences to see if maybe they knew what happened to Melanie. But as of right now, there really was no new leads. They did not know where Melanie was. And it was right around this point that Etta's listening to the news about Melanie that Etta heard a voice in the room she was in. And the voice said very clearly to Etta, she's not in one of those houses. And Etta immediately, when she heard it, she turned around wondering who the heck was in here, who's talking to her, but there was nobody else in the room. And then it was like immediately there were these flashes of images in Etta's brain that she had no idea what they meant, but it was a succession of a dirt road and then a bush and then something white, a nurse's shoe. And Etta very clearly saw these 3 images. And it was right then that Etta thought, oh my God, I know where Melanie Uribe is. And so she sat there wondering what to do, and then finally thought, I have to go to police, as crazy as this sounds. And so she hopped in the car and she drove to the police station and she said, I don't know how, but I do know Melanie Uribe is right there in that canyon. But when the police had said, come back tomorrow and we'll go out and look for her, Etta just couldn't wait, and so she had gone with her kids, driven out to the canyon that she had seen in her mind, and sure enough, when she got out there, she found the dirt road that she had seen, then she found the bush that she had seen, and then with the help of her kids, they found the white nurse's shoe, and it was right near Melanie's body. Which meant that voice that Etta heard and the vision she had had all been real. The phone call that the police captain received on the 4th day that Etta was sitting in jail and talking to the undercover cop, the phone call that changed the whole case, well, the phone call was from another police officer saying they had just arrested 3 men who were caught bragging about beating and killing Melanie Uribe, and they had confessed and they were now being held in jail. And so clearly, Etta did not commit this murder, and so even though it made no sense that she just knew where this body was, the police had to release Etta the same day, so she was released, and then ultimately the 3 men who confessed to killing Melanie Uribe, they would be found guilty, and they would each be sentenced to life in prison. 6 years later, Etta would sue the police department, and she would win the lawsuit because the jury on that case absolutely believed that Etta really did have a psychic vision that led to the discovery of Melanie's body. Etta would never go on to make a movie about her story, and in fact, when she was asked later on about why she said that during her conversations with that undercover cop, Etta would clarify that she didn't say that she wanted to make a movie, but rather she said to the undercover cop something to the effect of, it feels like I'm living out a bad movie. And so that was kind of misconstrued by police into her saying, I want to make a movie about this. She didn't and has never made a movie and in no way has sought out any fame or recognition for what happened. Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timisoara. Loana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Loana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Loana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these 2 Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Loana as like the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, when she had not made a full recovery at all, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Loana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob, and that perhaps she had checked herself out of the hospital too soon, and untreated, that's why she must have passed away early. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies, and on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Loana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Loana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those 2 Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her that led to the mob coming and attacking her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the 2 primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Loana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Loana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing this image, which is of Loana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that they will have bouts of extreme sleep paralysis. These are people that have never had sleep paralysis before, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Loana. And so now that you've seen this image, you're cursed too. So, Kevin Bardsley and his 12-year-old son Garrett went on a father-son Boy Scout camping trip in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. Their campsite was situated next to Lake Quiberon inside of the Wasatch National Forest. The lake was actually pretty remote and difficult to access because it was almost completely surrounded by huge mountains. The only side you could get to the lake on was its western side, but the western trail leading to it was very cumbersome because you had to bypass 7 different lakes. And so by the time Kevin, Garrett, and the rest of the Boy Scouts and their fathers were at the lake, they were at least an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization. Early in the morning on August 20th, Kevin and Garrett woke up, they hopped out of their tents, none of the other campers had woken up yet, and so they decided they would head down to the lake to get some early fishing in. And so they got their gear and they began walking down the very well-defined 150-meter long trail down to the lake. As they get there, the sun's coming up over the mountains and they're really excited about their day of fishing. And so as Kevin is preparing a fishing rod for Garrett, Garrett was jumping around on different stones that were poking out of the water. And at some point he tripped and he fell into the water, soaking his shoes and his pants. And so he hopped out of the water and he's kind of laughing at himself, and he told his dad that he didn't care, he'd fish with wet feet and wet pants and he would change them later. And so Kevin laughed and handed his son his fishing rod, and then the two of them began to fish. After a while, when they hadn't caught anything, Garrett said to his dad that, you know what, Dad, this is actually pretty uncomfortable, I'm gonna go change my pants and my socks. And so Kevin said, no problem, I'll be here with our gear, I'll see you when you get back. And so Garrett stands up and he starts walking back up the well-defined 150-meter trail back up towards the campsite, and Kevin actually turned around and watched his son disappear into the trees, but he heard the sound of other campers at the campsite and so knew his son wouldn't be alone. For the next couple of minutes, Kevin kept fishing, but periodically would look over his shoulder expecting to see Garrett come out of the woods again, but he didn't. And after about 20 minutes, Kevin was a little bit concerned, so he picked up his fishing gear and began walking back up the trail towards the camp. When he got there, he saw other Boy Scouts and their fathers just getting up and having a bite to eat, and he's scanning around the campsite and he doesn't see Garrett, and so he goes over to Garrett's tent and he opens it up and Garrett's not in there, and there's no sign that he's removed any of his wet clothing in there. And so Kevin turns around and he asks one of the fathers, hey, have you seen Garrett? He was supposed to be up here a minute ago. And the father said, no, I haven't seen him. And so Kevin's starting to panic and he yells out to the group, hey, has anyone seen my son? Do you guys know where Garrett went? He was supposed to be up here. And no one knew where he was. They said, no, we haven't seen him. And so horrified, Kevin drops all of his gear and starts running back towards the lake, screaming for his son. And the other campers instinctively know what's going on, and so they chase after him, yelling for Garrett. Almost immediately, the sheriff's department was notified and they launched this huge search that included the FBI. And so hundreds of people have descended into the area around the lake and they're looking for Garrett. They can't find him, but later that afternoon, searchers were about a half-mile away from where Garrett was last seen, and they found a single Nike sock that appeared to have been removed from a wet foot wedged into one of the boulders in this huge boulder field. Garrett's mother would confirm that was Garrett's sock, and so the search effort was shifted to this big boulder field, and for days they looked all over the place for him, but there was no sign of Garrett anywhere, and so eventually the search was terminated. The authorities determined this was an accident, that Garrett's father and the other campers had nothing to do with Garrett's disappearance. What their theory was is Garrett must have gotten lost on the walk back to the camp and then ultimately died of exposure. But the idea that a boy of Garrett's age would get lost along a well-defined 150-meter long trail that he was familiar with, that he had been on that day, that seems a little far-fetched. Also, as Garrett was walking down that trail, he would have heard the sounds of the other campers in the campsite. So that would have helped him figure out exactly where he needed to go. He's on a well-marked trail, he's walking towards the sound of the voices. But he never made it to the campsite because no one at the camp saw him, and there was no sign that he had put his wet clothes in his tent. So something happened to Garrett almost immediately when he left his father that caused him to wind up a half-mile away in a boulder field with one sock missing. It screams abduction case. But remember, this campsite was over an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization, and they know this group of Boy Scouts and their fathers were the only ones in the area that day. It is possible that an animal could have taken Garrett, like a mountain lion, but there would have been signs of a struggle, and they didn't find any on the trail or anywhere nearby, and you would figure if he was getting dragged off by a big predator, he would have yelled out for help, but he didn't. He just left his dad, it was total silence, and then he vanished. And all we have is his one son. A father and his young son were out for a walk in their small suburban town just outside of Barcelona, Spain. When they reached their downtown, they were going to turn around and walk back home, but the boy pleaded with his father to make a quick quick stop at the old theater. The reason the boy and many other kids in the town loved going to this old theater was because out front of it was this huge papier-mâché statue of a dinosaur, a stegosaurus to be exact. And so after a little bit of convincing, the father finally agrees and they start heading in that direction. After they turned the corner and could actually see the dinosaur statue, the boy took off running while the father just stayed back and walked leisurely, watching his son the whole time. And as he's watching his son, he can see he gets right up to the statue, and then the boy just kind of suddenly stops and stares at something on the bottom of the statue. And so the father notices his son has seen something peculiar enough to make him stop and stare, and so he yells to his son, "Hey, what do you see?" And the son just points at the back right leg of the statue. And so the father thinks this is really weird, so he jogs up to his son and he crouches down right next to him and looks in the direction his son is pointing. And at first, the father believes all his son is pointing at is this fairly obvious crack on the outside of the statue on the back right leg. And he's thinking his son has just noticed that the statue is kind of falling apart. But as he's looking at this crack that his son is pointing at, he realized his son was not pointing at the crack. He was pointing at what was behind the crack, what was inside the dinosaur statue. And when the father realized what he was looking at, he grabbed his son, stood up, and ran in the other direction and called emergency services. A few minutes later, the police and fire department show up in front of this old theater. They get out and they go up to the statue and they confirm what's inside this back right leg. Afterwards, they go to their trucks and they get out chainsaws. Eventually, they were able to carve a big enough square on this back right leg that they were able to remove the thing that the father and the son had seen originally, and that was a dead man's body. Not much is known about this dead man, except that he was a 39-year-old man who his family had reported missing a couple of days before he was actually found. While we don't know this for sure, it's believed he decided to crawl inside the statue when he realized the belly of the dinosaur was movable. Now, it's not entirely clear how he figured that out. Either the belly was already moved and he saw the opening and so saw the opportunity to crawl inside for some reason, or he was poking and prodding at the statue and discovered the belly was movable, moved it aside, and then again seized the opportunity and crawled inside. But either way, the man crawled inside the statue, and then once he was in the dinosaur, his phone slipped out of his hand or slipped out of his pocket, and then instead of falling out of the dinosaur onto the ground, it fell inside the dinosaur and slid down the inside of the statue until it fell into the bottom of the bottom right-hand leg. And so the man decides to go after his phone, and so on his belly, he slides over to the back right leg, and then he begins lowering himself head first into the leg, reaching for his phone. And so as he's kind of slowly lowering himself down, using his legs to pin himself inside the statue, he gets closer and closer, and he's almost about to grab his phone when his feet lose their grip, and he slips and falls headfirst all the way to the bottom of this back right leg. The space he was in was so tight, he was not able to turn himself around and climb up and out again. In fact, it was so tight, he could barely move. His arms were pinned by his side, and so he couldn't use them to even push himself back up and out. And because he could not bend his legs, he could not use his legs to pull himself back out again either. And so this man most likely began screaming for help, but for whatever reason, nobody heard him. And so after what must have been several agonizing days, the man finally just died. His autopsy has not been made public, so we don't know for sure what actually killed him, although one could speculate he died of either dehydration or perhaps asphyxia from being trapped in this really tight space where his chest may not have been able to expand all the way, and so he would have eventually suffocated. Following the gruesome discovery, the dinosaur statue was removed from the front of the Old Navy decided it was time to decommission one of their old frigate ships, and so they sent it to a dock to be broken down for scrap. In order for workers to actually be able to access the underside of the ship and actually begin to break it down, they would need to dry dock the ship, which meant the ship would basically drive into this special locking corral where the doors would shut behind it, the water would drain out from underneath, and the ship would be left resting on these huge wooden blocks that elevated it off the ground. And with no water in there, workers were able to get underneath the hull and could access every part of the ship without obstruction. It's important to note for this story that when a ship is in dry dock, there is only one way on or off. It's this ramp called a gangway that leads from the dock onto the deck of the ship. Besides that, there is nowhere else for you to get on this ship. And if for some reason you really wanted to get on and couldn't use the gangway, you could in theory try to run and leap from the dock to the ship. There's a pretty significant gap there all the way around, but you could try the jump. But if you weren't successful at grabbing onto the ship, you would fall multiple stories, probably to your death, because there's no water in the dry dock. So this old frigate ship that was being decommissioned was officially dry docked in July of 2014. The first group of people that went on board the ship to begin dismantling it were military personnel. They were in charge of removing all of the sensitive equipment before civilians were allowed to go on board. The military personnel begin to wrap up, and it's getting late in the day, and they tell the foreman, who's in charge of all of the civilian workers that are going to be going on and finishing this decommissioning of the ship. They go to the foreman and they say, hey, we're done, we're wrapped up for the night, your workers are good to go, they can get on here tomorrow. The foreman would send a message to his boss that night, letting him know that they were on track to start work the next day. The boss would respond and say, hey, can you go on there tonight and take pictures of all the different workstations so we know how many people that we need to place in different segments of this big ship. So the foreman walks onto the ship and proceeds to take hundreds of pictures all over the inside of the ship. Now, the ship itself was pitch black inside. There was no electricity and it was nighttime. So he had a flashlight the whole time, but whenever he took a picture, he would turn his flashlight off and then use the flash on his camera before going back to his actual flashlight. So all night he's going room to room taking all these pictures, and at some point he realizes he's photographed everything he needs to. So he leaves, he goes back to his office, he uploads the pictures, and he sends them to his boss. His boss wrote back almost immediately and just said, "Who's the guy with the axe?" Now, the foreman has no idea what he's talking about. He was just in the ship by himself for a couple of hours and didn't see anyone. So he reads the email again to make sure he read it correctly, and he sees that his boss has actually attached the picture he is referring to. Here is this guy clearly clutching an axe in a hallway that he was just in. And even creepier is the foreman is looking at where this picture was taken, and it was relatively early on in his photo shoot. And he had walked past the exact area where this guy is poking his head out of, which means the whole time he was down there, this guy with an axe was there with him. They review the security footage of a camera that was aimed directly at the ramp, the one entrance in and out of this ship. And from the time the foreman left, no one else left. So they don't know how he got on or how he got off without being detected, but somehow